I had lived on the same corner property in northern Missouri for almost a decade, long enough to know every crack in the gravel driveway, every maple tree that leaned over the fence line, and every neighbor who waved when they drove by. It wasn't a fancy place, just a modest ranch house with a detached workshop behind it, but it was mine, and one of the reasons I bought it was the long side driveway that ran from the street all the way back to my garage. That driveway wasn't shared, wasn't disputed, and wasn't one of those confusing situations where nobody really knew where the property line sat. The previous owner next door, an older guy named Frank, understood exactly where the boundary was. We never had a single disagreement in 9 years. Then Frank retired, sold the house, and moved south. A month later, a new family arrived. They seemed friendly enough at first. The husband, who I'll call Derek, shook my hand the first week and told me they planned to stay for years. His wife talked about renovations, landscaping, and increasing property value. Looking back, that phrase should have been my first warning. Some people move into a neighborhood and try to become part of it. Other people move in and immediately start redesigning everything around them. By the beginning of summer, construction trucks started showing up. Lumber, concrete, roofing materials, stacks of steel brackets. It looked like they were building something substantial. One afternoon I walked over and asked what the project was. Derek smiled and proudly explained they were adding a second garage beside the house. I nodded and wished them luck. At that point I didn't think much about it. People build garages all the time. The problem started about 2 weeks later. Every morning, I backed my SUV down the driveway on my way to work. One day, I noticed the new structure looked strangely close to my side of the property. Not close enough to trigger immediate alarm, but close enough to make me slow down and look twice. I convinced myself it was probably an optical illusion. Construction sites always look crowded while they're being built. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was backing out like usual when my passenger side mirror nearly clipped a temporary support beam. I slammed the brakes and stared out the window. For a second I honestly thought I had drifted off course. Then I got out and walked toward the structure. The closer I got, the worse it looked. The roofline wasn't merely near my driveway. It was hanging over it. Not by a few inches either. Several feet. I stood there staring up at the overhang, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. The next day, I grabbed a tape measure. The numbers only made me more uncomfortable. Part of their brand new garage appeared to extend directly over land that belonged to me. So I decided to handle it like an adult. No yelling. No threats. No drama. I walked over and knocked on their door. Derek answered. I pointed toward the garage and asked if they had completed a survey before building. He laughed, actually laughed, and said the contractor had handled everything. I asked whether he had copies of the measurements. He shrugged. Then he gave me a smile that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. You're worrying too much, he said. The builder knows what he's doing. I told him the structure appeared to cross the property line. He folded his arms and looked back toward the garage. Then he delivered the sentence that changed my entire attitude toward the situation. It's only a few feet, he said. You can still drive. Now maybe that doesn't sound like much, but when somebody says that about your property, they're telling you something important. They aren't saying they made a mistake. They aren't saying they'll double-check the measurements. They're saying they know there's a problem and they expect you to tolerate it. The moment he said those words, I stopped viewing this as a misunderstanding. I started viewing it as a test. He wanted to see whether I would simply accept losing part of my access because fixing his mistake would cost money. The following morning, I called an independent survey company. If there was going to be an argument, I wanted facts instead of opinions. 3 days later, the survey crew arrived. They spent hours measuring, marking, and reviewing old county records. Late that afternoon, the lead surveyor walked over carrying a clipboard. Before he even spoke, I could tell from his expression that the news wasn't good. Bright red stakes now ran along the exact property boundary. The results were worse than I imagined. The corner of their garage crossed over the legal line by nearly 4 feet. The roof overhang stretched even farther. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no measurement dispute. Part of their garage was sitting above land that legally belonged to me. I took photographs from every angle. I documented everything. Then I mailed copies of the survey directly to them. Days passed. No response. No apology. No attempt to discuss solutions. Nothing. Finally, I walked over again and knocked on their door. Derek opened it, glanced at the survey paperwork for maybe 2 seconds, then handed it back. His response was almost unbelievable. He said removing the garage would be too expensive. Then he suggested I simply use the remaining width of my driveway. As if the problem was mine. As if losing access to part of my property was a reasonable compromise. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance had just inspired me to stop asking for cooperation and start looking for leverage. And once I started digging into property records, access regulations, and county ordinances, I found something that would eventually turn his brand new garage into the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of property disputes go sideways. People hear 4 feet and immediately think, well, that's not a huge deal. But according to standard procedure, property lines aren't suggestions, they're legal boundaries. From a legal perspective, once a permanent structure crosses onto someone else's land, the issue stops being about convenience and starts becoming a matter of ownership rights, liability, access, and future property value. What made this situation even more serious was the driveway itself. It wasn't decorative space. It was functional access to my workshop and rear garage. If that access becomes restricted, the impact can be much larger than the square footage involved. And honestly, this is a psychological trap I've seen many times. People invest thousands of dollars into a project, then become emotionally attached to the outcome. Instead of admitting a mistake early, they convince themselves everyone else should accommodate it. The more money they've spent, the harder they fight reality. The lesson here is simple. Small encroachments often become big conflicts, not because of the land itself, but because pride gets involved. Unfortunately for Derek, pride was about to become a very expensive hobby. After that conversation, I stopped wasting energy trying to convince Derek that he had a problem. He already knew he had a problem. The survey proved it. The photographs proved it. The property records proved it. What he was really betting on was that I would eventually decide fighting wasn't worth the trouble. And honestly, that's probably how situations like this usually end. Most people don't want conflict with neighbors. Most people would rather absorb the inconvenience than spend months dealing with lawyers, contractors, and county offices. Derek was counting on that. Unfortunately for him, he had completely misread the person living next door. Over the following week, I spent my evenings digging through county records and local access regulations. I wasn't looking for revenge. At least not at first. I was looking for options. The more I researched, the more interesting the situation became. The driveway wasn't shared. It wasn't subject to any agreement requiring me to maintain clearance for neighboring properties. The entire strip of land belonged exclusively to me. That meant I had considerable authority over how it was used, provided I followed local regulations. One section of the county code caught my attention immediately. Property owners were permitted to install protective clearance structures at driveway entrances for access management and vehicle protection. I must have read that paragraph 6 times. Then I smiled. For the first time since the garage appeared, I saw a solution that didn't involve lawsuits, court hearings, or endless arguments. The following Monday, I called a local metal fabrication company. The owner came out to inspect the site. I explained exactly what I wanted. He took measurements, nodded several times, and asked a few technical questions. Before leaving, he looked toward the neighboring garage and raised an eyebrow. Interesting situation, he said. I just smiled and said, you could say that. A week later, 2 trucks arrived early in the morning. One carried steel posts. The other carried concrete, equipment, and a long black steel beam. The crew started unloading materials beside my driveway. It didn't take long for Derek to notice. His garage had become the centerpiece of his property, and now several workers were setting up directly beside it. He came outside wearing that familiar confident expression I'd grown accustomed to seeing. What's going on? He asked. I told him calmly that I was making improvements to my driveway access. He looked confused. The workers began marking locations near the entrance. Then they started digging. 2 deep holes appeared on either side of the driveway. Derek watched silently for several minutes before walking over again. What exactly are you building? He asked. A vehicle clearance bar, I said. Something to protect access to my garage and workshop. His forehead wrinkled. He still didn't understand. The crew lowered the steel posts into place. Concrete was poured. Measurements were checked repeatedly. Everything was done carefully because I wanted absolutely no question about legality. According to standard procedure, every dimension had been reviewed beforehand. Every permit requirement had been satisfied. Every setback regulation had been respected. By late afternoon, the moment finally arrived. The workers attached the massive horizontal beam between the posts. Slowly it rose into position. When the bolts were tightened, a solid black clearance bar stretched across the entrance of my driveway. The bottom of the beam sat exactly 7 feet above ground level. I drove my SUV underneath without any issue. Then everyone looked toward Derek's garage. That's when reality finally arrived. You see, the section of roof extending over my property sat lower than the clearance line. Not by much, but enough. Suddenly, the geometry of the entire situation changed. Any larger vehicle attempting to approach the garage from the practical turning angle would have to pass through airspace controlled by my property. The clearance bar prevented that movement. Trucks couldn't do it. Utility trailers couldn't do it. Cargo vans couldn't do it. Even some larger SUVs would struggle. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Derek stared at the beam. Then he stared at the garage. Then he stared at the beam again. You could practically hear the calculations happening inside his head. Finally, he spoke. "You can't be serious." I shrugged. "Everything is on my property." He looked furious. "You put that there because of my garage." "No," I replied. "I put it there to protect access to my garage." Technically, both statements were true. Over the next several days, the consequences became impossible to ignore. I watched from my workshop as Derek repeatedly attempted different parking approaches. Some were almost impressive. He tried backing in. He tried pulling through from various angles. He tried using the alley. He even brought over a friend who apparently believed confidence could overcome geometry. It couldn't. The garage technically remained accessible, but only under very limited conditions. The larger the vehicle, the more difficult the process became. Every attempt seemed to create fresh frustration. The irony was almost poetic. The structure had been built specifically to create convenience, and now it had become inconvenient by design. A few days later, I was mowing the lawn when Derek stormed across the property line. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're making it impossible to use my garage." I shut off the mower and looked at him. "Actually, your garage is making it impossible to use your garage." He didn't appreciate that answer. He launched into a long speech about costs, contractors, scheduling delays, and how much money had been invested in the project. Notice something missing from that list? Responsibility. At no point did he mention building over somebody else's property. At no point did he acknowledge the survey. Everything revolved around his inconvenience. That's another reason these disputes escalate. This is a psychological trap people fall into all the time. Once they're emotionally invested, they stop evaluating right and wrong. They start evaluating winners and losers. In Derek's mind, fixing the garage meant losing. Unfortunately, reality doesn't care about pride. The next week brought even more complications for him. Delivery drivers struggled. A contractor arrived with a trailer and immediately pointed at the clearance bar. Another visitor attempted a turn and gave up halfway through. Every day seemed to generate a fresh reminder that shortcuts eventually become expensive. Then came the moment that changed everything. About 2 weeks after the clearance bar went up, I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, Derek was standing there. But this wasn't the same man who had laughed at me weeks earlier. The confidence was gone. The smug smile was gone. Even his posture looked different. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if we could talk. We sat on the porch. He explained that the situation wasn't working. I nodded. He said they needed a practical solution. I nodded again. Finally, he asked what it would take to resolve the issue. I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking about how simple the answer really was. There had never been a mystery. There had never been a hidden agenda. The solution existed from the very beginning. "Move the garage," I said. "Completely off my property." He looked down at the porch floor. For the first time since this whole mess started, he didn't argue. He didn't blame contractors. He didn't talk about expenses. He simply sat there quietly. A few moments later, he asked, "If I do that, will you remove the clearance bar?" "Yes," I said. "The day the encroachment is gone." A long silence followed. Then he nodded. Not because he suddenly agreed with me. Not because we became friends. He nodded because he had finally run out of ways to avoid reality. Over the next month, contractors returned. Measurements were taken. Modifications were planned. Eventually, the offending section of the garage was rebuilt entirely within the proper boundary. County inspectors reviewed the work. The surveyor confirmed compliance. Only then did I schedule the removal of the clearance bar. The steel posts came down. The driveway returned to normal. And just like that, the conflict ended. No courtroom. No screaming match. No dramatic legal battle. Just a simple lesson delivered through consequences. Derek spent tens of thousands of dollars building a garage he couldn't properly use, then spent even more fixing a mistake that could have been avoided by listening to a survey in the first place. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through a judge. Sometimes it arrives through basic geometry and a steel beam standing exactly where the law says it has every right to be. Looking back on the whole thing, the part that stays with me isn't the survey, the steel beam, or even the garage itself. It's that one sentence Derek said during our very first conversation. It's only a few feet. You can still drive. At the time it sounded like a casual comment, but what he was really saying was that my inconvenience mattered less than his convenience. And honestly, that's how a lot of neighborhood conflicts begin. Rarely because of fences, driveways, trees, garages, or property lines. Most disputes start when one person decides they have the right to make decisions for somebody else's property. The garage was just the symptom. The real issue was entitlement. From a legal perspective, this entire situation could have turned into a lengthy and expensive court battle. There are property owners who spend years fighting encroachment cases. Some end up paying attorneys more than the disputed land is worth. That's why documentation matters. That's why surveys matter. That's why keeping emotions under control matters. According to standard procedure, the strongest position is usually the one supported by records, measurements, permits, and patience. Not anger. Not threats. Not social media arguments. Facts. That's what ultimately changed the outcome here. And there's another lesson hidden underneath all of this. This is a psychological trap that catches people every day. Once someone invests time, money, and pride into a project, admitting a mistake becomes emotionally painful. Instead of correcting the problem, they start defending it. The more obvious the mistake becomes, the harder they fight to justify it. I've seen it happen with home renovations, business decisions, family disputes, and neighborhood conflicts. Human beings often become prisoners of their own ego. Derek wasn't stubborn because he lacked intelligence. He was stubborn because admitting the garage had been built in the wrong place felt worse than continuing the conflict. Eventually, reality forced a decision that pride refused to make. The lesson here is simple. Respect property lines before concrete gets poured, before roofs get framed, and before lawyers get involved. A survey costs a tiny fraction of what a reconstruction project costs. More importantly, respecting boundaries builds trust with neighbors, while ignoring them destroys it. Even after the garage was fixed, things never really went back to the way they were. We waved occasionally. We kept things civil. But there was always a distance between us after that. Trust is a lot like a driveway. It's easy to drive across for years without thinking about it. But once somebody builds over it, suddenly every inch matters. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have taken the same approach? Would you have gone straight to court, tried to negotiate longer, or come up with a different solution entirely? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. Some folks think I should have been more accommodating. Others think I was far more patient than most property owners would have been. Either way, one thing is certain. The most expensive part of that garage wasn't the lumber, the concrete, or the labor. It was the assumption that someone else's property rights didn't matter. And that turned out to be a very costly miscalculation indeed.